last group that I want to mention in terms of the home front was the treatment of Jewish refugees. And this one doesn't fit exactly into the category of the others because many of these Jewish refugees never made it to the United States, or they were not accepted into the country, which becomes part of the story that we need to tell. First of all, understand that many Jews attempted to flee from the Third Reich, and much of this is happening during the 1930s, before we actually get to the period of the war itself, the mid to late 1930s. And we knew about them. Many of them made their way to the borders with the United States or attempted to get into the country, and many of them were turned away. What we see is that FDR made no significant attempt to change our policies to accept what was going to become a large number of Jews attempting to escape from near certain death if they remained in Europe under Hitler's regime. America's attitude to these refugees was cold and heartless. And it's actually stunning sometimes to read the quotes and documents from this era, many of which talk about these people as if they are just animals or not even living creatures. Here's one phrase. This is from a little bit earlier in history, but it expresses the kind of heartless attitude that we see. This person said, "When the Bolshevists in Russia are overthrown, there will be a great massacre of Jews, and I suppose we will get the overflow unless we can stop it." And so here he is talking about this great massacre of Jews taking place over in Europe, and yet his only concern is, how are we going to stop the overflow from attempting to come into our country? Historians have kind of wrestled with this question because it's an unpleasant reality that the United States did not make much of an effort to help the Jews that were trying to escape from the Third Reich. And so some historians have argued that FDR wasn't aware of what was going on, or that the country wasn't aware. But the evidence really doesn't bear that out. If you look back even at magazines from the 30s, Time magazine or Life magazine, there are articles in there explaining what is going on. There are testimonials from Jews who had already escaped and were explaining how they were being treated. And so the evidence was there that there were issues. Now, maybe we were not fully aware, and that's a different argument that we'll get to a little bit later. Maybe we didn't know the full extent of the mistreatment of the Jews, but certainly we were aware that they were being mistreated and that there were problems. And so could the State Department have made it a little easier for refugees to come into the country? Many of these people, for instance, could not have access to their passports or identification papers because they'd been destroyed, or if they were captured or something, that their papers had been lost. And yet what we see is that the State Department, in case after case, refused to make exceptions, continued to demand all of the evidence that they normally would, or even more. So the State Department contributes to this by making it even more difficult for Jewish refugees to come into the country. And there are other examples as well of opportunities where we could have made some very simple changes that might have saved tens of thousands of lives or more. As one example, the Rogers-Wagner bill came up for discussion in Congress in 1939. This bill proposed to admit 20,000 Jewish children into the country over and above whatever other immigration limits there might have been. This bill died in committee, never even came up for a vote in Congress, and one opponent of the bill was heard to say, "Cute Jewish kids grow up to be ugly Jewish adults." I think this is made even more stark when we know that the following year, in 1940, a very similar bill allowing 15,000 British children to immigrate passed unanimously with virtually no objection. Also in 1939, and perhaps the most famous case from this period, was that of the German ship the St. Louis, which sailed from Europe with about 1,000 Jewish refugees. It arrived in a number of different ports in the Caribbean, and the pictures that you see here are from people on the St. Louis. It eventually reached Miami and was docked at Miami Beach or near the beach for several days. People on the ship reported that they could hear the music from the beach, they could smell the food, and you see the people kind of looking out the window there at that point. And yet the ship was not accepted into the United States. It was returned to Europe, where the great majority of people on that ship eventually died in the concentration camps. So why didn't the United States make a greater effort to help when there was so obviously great need on the part of people trying to escape from what was happening in Europe? Well, there have been a lot of different answers proposed for this, some with some grounding, others more difficult to defend. One of them is that perhaps we didn't know the full extent of the tragedy that was going on. We didn't know what was happening in the concentration camps and so on. And as I've mentioned to you, it's hard to defend this argument as stated, because there was evidence coming out. There were people talking about what was happening, and so we did have some knowledge of what was happening. But I think a better argument to be made is that we couldn't accept what was going on, or we didn't believe what was happening. And we certainly have records of that. People in the American government, when they hear these reports, they write about them as if they are exaggerated or lies or made up. You know, nothing like that could ever happen. And it is difficult to imagine something like the Holocaust happening until you actually see the evidence and know that it did happen. So maybe there's an argument there that we didn't believe the full extent of the tragedy. But I think this is also rooted in the unfortunate reality of nativism, racism, anti-Semitism. Call it what you will, is very prominent in our country at that time. A sort of general anti-immigrant feeling, but coupled specifically with anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish emotion. The argument was also made that this was still going on in the midst of the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce. We were deporting Mexicans at the same time. So making exceptions for 10,000 Jews or 20,000 Jews, there is some grounding for that argument. And finally, there is the fear proposed by some that if we just open our gates to this overflow of Jewish immigration, that Hitler would plant spies in their midst. And I suppose this is possible. It's the sort of thing that we have to wrestle with as a people and a nation. Would that risk have been worth the prospect of saving 10,000 lives, 20,000 lives, or more? No one has proposed that the United States could have prevented the Holocaust, or that we even could have stopped the worst of the Holocaust. But we might have saved 10,000 more lives, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 or more, had we taken some different actions during this period that we didn't. And so what we do know is that more than 6 million Jews perished during the Holocaust, and the United States did virtually nothing to try to help and stop it.